So we'll be continuing with task 2 of these 9.2 labs in just a few minutes at 12:35. So we'll finish up with task 2 of this, and then what I'm going to do is go back to 9.1, and we'll go through that with one of these setting screens. So to kind of tie 9.1 and 9.2 together. That's the plan for today. And then we'll move on to lesson 10 tomorrow. I need to turn myself up on mute, off mute. So the plan is we finished up with task 1 of the 9.2 labs yesterday. So we're going to go through task 2 of these labs here using the settings template. And then we're going to go kind of back to 9.1 because I want to go through that lab and build it with this kind of setting screen that we've just covered in 9.2. And there's a few gotchas as I was working through that this morning, just checking that I had all my ducks in a row. I did run into some kind of gotchas. There's some tricks I had to use to make that work. And kind of getting all the workflow of the life cycle to work in a way that's kind of sensical, as the user might expect. So I want to go over how to, we'll finish up 9.2, and we're going to go back to 9.1 labs and go over those. And that's really the plan for today. So we're going to finish up the 9.2 labs, go back and talk about the 9.1 labs, and then tomorrow we're going to start on lesson 10. So let's get going here. What you'll want to do, let me get into Inside Rankin over here as student. So you'll want to go on to Inside Rankin. You'll want to go under lesson 9, okay? And pull down this Droid Cafe with settings starter zip. The reason for that is there is a starter project that they tell you to start with in the lab, starting in task 2. It's going to tell you to start with the Droid Cafe project. But depending on where you're at, because we did that lab earlier, yours may be at a different place than everybody else. I also wanted to make sure that got updated to Jetpack. So kind of in the interest of saving some time and making sure that we're all starting in the same place, this is the starter project that I actually want you to start with. Okay, so I'm going to click on here and download it. I want you to extract. I'm going to extract this here. Let me make a folder for it. Okay, so I've got Droid Cafe zip. I'm going to go into my projects folder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder here. So I'm going to call this new folder. We're going to call this Droid Cafe with settings live. So that's going to be the name of this folder. Post that in chat. So what I want to do now, open up that project. I'm going to take everything that's in the zip file and copy it into that folder I just created. So now your Droid Cafe with settings live, that's where we're going to do this example. Okay. And if you did pull it down yesterday, just go ahead and rename the folder to be that. So I'm going to open that folder up in Android Studio. File, open. Droid Cafe with settings live. Open that in a new window. Okay. All right, so starting on task 2, I'm going to run this on the device. Okay. So there's where we're at. I went and touched up my font sizes, so that should be fine. You shouldn't have to. I already went through and changed it to Droid Cafe with settings, and that should solve the problem of needing to change the packaging. So you should be fine with just keeping this packaging for what we're doing here. So we want to run that. If we look at where we're at here right now, I see that there is a menu, but you'll notice that there's no settings item in there. There was originally when we created this from the basic activity template, but since we've switched it over to since we did the previous lab, we actually had removed the settings option in that lab. So we actually we'll need to put it back in. All right. So let's kind of look at what the objective is here. So this is historically, this is how that settings template would generate. It would generate the settings screen with three different groups. It would be general, notifications, data sync, and it would have a few different settings in it. And it also would generate it in such a way that it looked this way on the phone as separate screens. And then on a tablet, it would be kind of tabs on the left, and then that would bring you into the items there. So with the original template, at least at the time that this tutorial was written, it looked very different what the template generated. What the template generated was this. So I think it kind of, if you saw the screen, if you remember kind of what was on the screenshots from the slides yesterday, you'll remember that looks a little bit different, and that's the big thing that makes this is why I didn't want to just give you guys this lab and go run with it, because it's very hard to figure out, okay, things have changed, what should I do? So we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not going to follow the steps exactly because of all that, because the template has changed so dramatically. But we're going to kind of walk through the important parts of this task. So what we want to do first is create that settings activity. Okay, so I'm going to go on to Droid Cafe with settings. I'm going to start there, start on the package. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say new. I'm going to say new activity, and I'm going to say new settings activity. Okay, so we're going to keep the default name of settings activity. Title still going to be settings. I don't want to split this into multiple screens. I'm going to keep this all on one screen. Remember, if I check this box, that's going to split it up into separate screens, the settings activity. So you kind of have these larger level headers, and then it's going to go into those categories. Those are going to be kind of a quote-unquote separate screen. The way it actually sets up, it's just fragments, so it's really all still one activity, but at least to the user, it looks like it's separate screens. Okay, so we want to make sure we leave that box unchecked, and we also want to make sure we pick the parent activity, and that's going to make the up navigation work. So I want it to go back to the main activity when you leave the settings. So that's what I'm going to pick as the parent activity. So the important things to make sure we're picking there is the parent activity, and then just leave this box unchecked. Okay, now I'm going to hit finish. It's going to take a little minute, but it's going to create a different files. It's going to ask if I want to add the files it just generated to version control, and I'm going to say yes. And I say, yep, I do want to add these. Okay. So before we go too much further, I do want to make sure that just, okay, we've got this started. I'm going to go ahead and check it in kind of at the state we're in. Now, yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and just check this in as is. So I'm going to go to my folder, right click here, say commit. Yeah, so I want to commit everything from this project right now. 9.2 task 2. Okay. So we're going to commit that and push it. Okay. So that's all pushed up. So we have kind of a nice baseline for where we're at. Now, when we said create new activity from the settings activity from using that template, there's a few things that it did. So first and foremost is it did actually create this root preferences file. Usually we would call this preferences.xml. Here they've just called it root preferences.xml. What you name it is kind of up to you, but usually we're just going to name it preferences.xml. But this is how it created it. So we've got a preferences XML. If we look at it here, I can go to the design tab and see kind of what's here. So there's a messages category, which has 2 settings here. There is a sync category, which has another 2 settings. So if I look on the right, you can kind of see the preference category, another preference category. If I look at it in the text with the preview, you can see, so this is the messages category with an edit text preference and a list preference, and then you've got the preference category with a switch, 2 switches. Now, one of the things that you'll see, there's this app dependency here. This is app dependency setting, app dependency sync. So what that means is this switch is only enabled when this other switch is turned on. Right? So if this switch is off, you can't turn this one off or on. As soon as you turn this one on, then you can change this one off or on. So it means that these settings kind of depend on this other switch. This dependency only works based on, you can only connect this to other switches. You can't connect this to say this is dependent on edit text or dependent on list preference. It does, if you're creating a dependency, it does have to be on a switch. So the idea is that switch just turns off and on a group of settings. Okay. So that's the basic template that we've got, right? So it created this preference.xml file. And it also created a settings activity. Okay. So if we look at settings activity here, we can see it's a subclass of app compat activity. We can see that it has actually created a layout. There is actually a settings activity layout. So if I look here, but it's not really all that complicated, right? So we have a linear layout, and then inside of that is a frame layout. That's all it created. But the important thing to see here with the layout that they've created is you see this frame layout. Well, this has an ID of settings, okay? So this is where we're actually going to put the fragment. This would be kind of the way you would set it up if you needed other controls to be on that settings screen, not just your settings fragment. Usually that's not something you need, but if you did need to set it up that way, you can. Usually I would want to use a constraint layout here instead of a linear layout to be more flexible in that case. But that's how it's setting it up. So we're going to replace this frame layout. That's where we're actually going to show our fragment, the way this is set up. So let's go here. I want to go back to settings activity. Okay. So in settings activity, we can see that we're inflating that layout. Set content view uses that settings activity layout. And then we have the code to show the fragment. So I say get support manager, begin, transaction, replace, and commit. The difference here is rather than doing that android.r.id.content, which is the example that we saw on the slides, and we historically kind of is the norm, we're putting that RID settings, which is that frame layout that's in the settings activity layout. Okay, so that's what's happening here. And then there's also the support action bar as well that's happening down there. So there is the core code. We remember seeing that on the slide yesterday to display the fragment. And then here's my class for the settings fragment. And this is really same thing we did yesterday. So it's a nested class called settings fragment, and you can see that they've marked it as a static class. And remember, that static keyword means that there's not a reference to the class that it's nested inside. So the settings fragment does not have a reference to settings activity, and the reason for that is just for garbage collection, making sure we don't have memory leaks, because effectively we don't need that reference. So that's how this is set up initially. So we have a working, quote-unquote, working settings activity. The problem is there's no way to get to it. So we've really just created this activity, but we don't have any way to get to it. So that's the thing we need to do next. Once we've created the template, we need to go back and create a pathway to get there. Okay, so the way we're going to get there is going to be from main activity. If I look at the layout for main activity, you remember that it's got that options menu up here. And that's how we're going to get there, is we're going to add a settings item to that menu. So I'm going to go into menu main, and we're going to add an item to that. Now, if we look at what's already here, we've got the order icon, which is that shopping cart. We've got a status icon, which is there, little I. We've got a favorites that's showing up in the drop-down menu, and we've got contact that's showing up at the bottom of the menu. So what I want to do is I'm going to add that settings in right above the contact, because I would want the contact to appear last in this case, and then I want settings to appear right above that. So I'm going to add in a settings item here. Okay, so ID settings, I'm going to give that an order of 50. 50 is going to put it after the favorites, but before the contact. Remember, those are just sort of in order. The reason for the gaps is to allow for space for other things, potentially if you wanted to insert in between. And then I need to specify the title. So I'm going to put that in as action settings. That should already be there in the strings XML file. That's kind of a leftover from what was previously done with the basic activity. Already added that settings item to your strings XML. It just never got removed. So it should still be there. And I'm going to mark it as nav. I'm going to change this to be, say, if room, right? So what this means is that on, say, a smartphone, on a phone, well, there's not enough space for it, so it's going to show up in the drop-down menu here. But what I want it to do is come up here if there's space to put it up there, say on a tablet. Now, if I want it to come up as an icon, as an action item like there, I do need to add an icon for it. So let's go do that real quick. So I'm going to go into Drawable, and right-click on Drawable. I'm going to say New Image Asset. We're going to add that settings icon. So I'm going to pick Action Bar and Tab Icons. I'm going to go to IC. I'm going to call this IC Settings. Okay, and I'm going to change it to be the settings clip art. So I want it to be this gear here. Okay, so that's the icon I want. I want it to be light colored because my action bar is dark colored. If it was reversed, let's say I had a very light action bar, I'd want a dark. I would want a dark icon instead. So I'm going to leave that as hollow dark. Okay, so we're going to create IC settings. Next, finish. Go ahead and add that to version control. Yep. And then back in here, I can add that icon now. So I'm going to add that here to the settings item icon, and that's going to be equal to drawable IC settings. So that's going to mean on tablets that it shows up as an icon in the bar instead of being down here. Now, whether or not you want it to show up there, if you want it to always be down there, I would just leave this as never. But if you do want it to pop up as an actual icon on the bar, that's what I would do, is mark it as if room. Okay. So let's run that real quick and just see that, check that the item's actually appearing. Okay, so on a phone, it's down here. I can click on it. It's still not doing anything yet, but it is in the menu. If I run this on a tablet, there we go. So if I run a tablet sideways, you can see that there's the settings icon there now. Okay, so we've added it to the menu. You'll remember that anytime we add something to the menu, we then need to go back to the activity code and actually respond to that menu item. Okay, so I've got that menu item there. We're going to go back to the main activity class. I'm going to go look for the on option item selected method. So we got a few different things that are happening here depending on which item you select. So I'm going to go and just add it to the end here right before the default case. So I'm going to say case r.id.action settings, because that's the ID that we used in the menu resource file. I'm going to say start activity. Start activity, new intent, this settings activity dot class. We're going to send an implicit intent to start that settings activity, and we're going to say return true to say that we've handled that menu item. Okay, so now let's run that. Okay, so I can click that here. That works on the tablet. So I can go to the settings menu there. I'm going to go back to my phone and test it there too. Okay, so now I can get to that settings menu. Does anybody have any issues with this at this point? Getting the settings menu item hooked up. Okay. So just to rehash, yesterday we went through task 1, and in task 1 we created the settings activity from just an empty activity. But here we've used that settings activity template to create at least get the settings activity started for us. So sometimes that will save you a little bit of time to use that settings activity template. It really depends on what you're doing. When we do 9.1, I'm just going to go ahead and do it again through the empty activity to make sure that we know where all those pieces are. But you can do it this way. This may save you some time. It does, however, mean if we were to say remove these settings, it might lead to a little bit extra work because there's stuff that you have to then remove because it's already added some settings and some strings. So if I want to now go kind of work with these settings. Let's see, where are we at in this? Cool. So we're basically down to 2.3. And this is where it gets real interesting because, well, 2.3 says, okay, look at all the codes there, and here's the settings that are already there. Well, let's go change them. Well, let's look at what's already there in this kind of new template. So I'm going to go to root preferences. Let's look a little bit deeper into what's there and close the other tabs. Okay, so in root preferences, we've got the edit text, pretty self-explanatory. What I'll look at is this list preference. Okay, so in the list preference, we've got a default value. We can see it's set to reply. It's not pulled from any source strings XML file, because we want it literally to always be reply whatever language is in there. Okay, and then we'll notice that we have this app entries and app entry values, right? So both of these are set to some sort of array, right? So we've got entries as array, reply entries. Entry values is reply values. Okay, well, let's look at what the setting looks like real quick, the reply setting over here. If I click on it, you can see it says reply to all. Well, these values that we're seeing here, those are the entries. Okay, that's the entries setting. That's this reply entries array. The thing that we're not seeing and what's actually being saved, so if I pick an option here, it doesn't save it as what I'm seeing. It saves it using the value here in the reply values array. So we've got kind of the text that the user sees, but we've also got the text that is saved. Okay, so if I look at arrays.xml, I can look at what those arrays are. So here's our first array. That's our entries. This is the text that the user sees. They're going to see reply to all in that casing, but when we actually go to save it to our shared preference file, what's actually going to be saved to the shared preference file is this text right here. It's going to be all either reply all lowercase or reply underscore all lowercase. So this is the value we're saving, but this is the value we're displaying. Okay, so anytime we have a list preference, we need both of these arrays. We're going to have one array that we're going to save, which is not going to be translated. We want that to be the same regardless of what language the user is using. And then we're also going to have another string array, which is the array that the user is going to see. This one will be translated. Okay, so this array is translated. This one's not. Okay, and this is the one we're going to use in our code. Any code that we write is going to run against this array. Now, one thing you might ask, and this does become an issue with the thing we're going to talk about in 9.1 when we look at that lab, is these both have to be string arrays. They can't be integer arrays. They can't be any other kind of array. The list preference only supports string arrays. That's it. It doesn't support integer arrays. It doesn't support color arrays or anything like that. It has to be an array of strings that you're picking and saving. Similar thing with the edit text preference. It can't actually save anything other than a string. It's going to save whatever value you put in here as a string. So that's maybe not ideal if you're working with numbers. And the other thing it doesn't really, at least in the current version, have full support of the input type setting. So the input type, you can apparently, looking on Stack Overflow, you can get that if you use your own kind of custom layout for that setting. But you do have to kind of override the layout to just get it to be a numbered keyboard, which is kind of convoluted. But that's the thing to understand. Both the edit text preference and the list preference always save their values as strings. Okay, which means that if we read it out, we're going to have to read it out also as strings and deal with all the things that come with that. Okay, so what we want to do, what we're going to do is add another setting to kind of get some practice with this list preference setting. So I'm going to go do, where did I add this? Oh, okay. I added this up at the top. Okay, so we're going to add a new section to the top of our preference screen. It's going to be a preference category. The name of that one will be account. So this is going to be app title account. And I'm going to give that I just add that as such. And then beneath that, I'm going to add a list preference. So this list preference will be kind of the market. What market are you in as far as you're using this app? So the key is going to be market. the title of that will be market with an uppercase M. I haven't extracted any of these string resources yet, but we'll do that in a minute. I also want to pick a default value. So my default value is going to be US. And I'm going to say, oh, why did that come in as Android? I want that as app. I want this to be uses simple summary provider true, because I want it to show the value that the user has selected. And then I'm just going to finish off this tag for now. Okay. So I'm still missing the two arrays, the array of entries and the array of entry values. We'll need to add those in a minute. But I have my basic list preference set up. Okay. I'm also going to add another list preference here. And this is going to be, the key for this one is going to be delivery method. So I'm going to add, so I have a market setting, I have a delivery method setting. This is going to be app title. And I'm going to use one of the settings, one of the strings I actually already have though for the title. So I'm going to say @string / choose delivery method. Because that's a string we had back on the order screen. We already put that in. And then I'm also going to say app use simple summary provider and set that to true. Okay. I do need to set the default value here as well. So the default value for that one is going to be same day. So same day delivery. Okay, so that's the start. Okay, so we're adding this account setting with two new list preferences. Now I need to actually create the arrays that back both of those list preferences. Okay, so I'm going to go back to arrays, and we're going to add two arrays for those things. So the first thing I'm going to add in here is going to be a string array. Oh, not string array. And this one is going to be named, let me pull it up over here. This is going to be market names. If I can spell that correctly. Market names. Then we're going to add a few items in here for the different markets. Okay, so the items I want to add in here, I'm going to paste those in. So I've got United States, Canada, United Kingdom, India, Japan, and other. And then I'm going to add another array for the market values, basically, or the market abbreviations. So the abbreviation for US, United States is US. Abbreviation for Canada is CA, UK, and then IN, JP, and this, I'm going to just make this uppercase other. So these are the values that we're actually going to store in the settings file, but these are the values that the user is going to see. On a similar note, I also need to add the, well, let me just hook those up. So we've got the two list of markets. I'm going to go hook those back in the market preference. So here we're going to have app entries. And we're going to point that at array market names. And this is going to be app entry values. This is going to be at array our market abbreviations. Okay. I've now got the value set up for the market. I need to do the same thing for the delivery method. Okay, so I'm going to add these in here. Now I already have the strings in strings XML for the different delivery methods, so I'm going to kind of reuse those strings. So the string array here I create is gonna reuse those values rather than typing them additionally here. So string array, this is going to be delivery method names. So the first delivery method, rather than hard coding the string here, I'm going to say at string. I need same day messenger service. So that's going to be the first value. Okay. And then item at string next day ground delivery item and this is going to be pickup. So the upside of creating the array that the user sees this way is that means we only have to translate these strings once. Rather than having to translate them both in the array as well as in the individual string items that are going to show up as radio buttons back on the order screen, I'm just going to reuse those same strings. So that means we don't additionally have to translate string array. Whatever translation we do in strings XML is automatically going to do that. So a similar sort of, this is kind of usually how you want to set things up. So realistically, both for the markets and the reply entries, I really want to take all these strings and have them actually be references to resources in strings XML, rather than them being here. However, on the other hand, I don't want these translated. Again, I want those translated, not these. So usually what you want to put in arrays XML is stuff that doesn't need to be translated, and stuff in strings XML, you're going to put stuff that does need to be translated. So that's kind of how you work with it. You're going to use those references. So we also need to add another string array for the actual delivery method, the values that we're going to store. So I'm going to call this delivery method values. And then I need a few different items here. Now, I'm going to create this as same day here. Item next day. And then item pickup. So these are the set of values that I'm going to save to the file. Okay. And now that I've got those strings typed in, there's both of those arrays created, I'm going to go back to root preferences and hook those two arrays up. So back over here, we're going to say that entries is at array delivery method name app entry values is going to be array delivery method values. Okay, so we've added two more settings to this screen, and we see that it should default to US and same day. Those should be the default values. Okay, let's run this, see that our settings are working correctly. I'm going to go to the settings screen. All right, so I've got my list of markets. We can see it's picked United States by default. Note that I've set the default value as US and it's automatically translating that from the value to the name of that thing, of that item. So it's showing it up as United States. It's not showing it up as US, even though that's what's actually saved in the file. Same thing here. We've got same day as the default value, but instead it's showing the name of that here. All right, so we've got those two settings hooked up. We have a place to store them. Now, if you remember from what we did yesterday, you do remember that there's still some work that we need to do to make sure that this settings file, this preferences file, gets initialized properly. Okay, and if you remember right, that was, I think it was preferences manager.set default values. So we need to call that when the app starts. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to add in an application object to make sure that gets set up, as well as providing a sort of standard way to get to both of these preferences that we've just added. So going back to the project, I'm going to add an application class. I'm just going to call it my app, or maybe I'll call it Droid Cafe app. Yeah, I'm going to call it Droid Cafe app. Add. I'm going to say this extends the application class. I'm going to do Alt-Enter to import that, and then we can start implementing the onCreate method. Okay, so I know for sure that I need to access the preferences, so I'm going to go ahead and create an instance variable for that. Private shared preferences, preferences. I'm going to store that there. I also want to be able to yeah, actually that's all I need there. So I need to create that variable, and then we need to get things set up. So I'm going to say preference manager dot set default values, this, and r.xml.root preferences s/false. So this is one of those things that you have to remember. The template doesn't add for you. The template doesn't add a way to get to the setting screen, as well as it doesn't add the logic to initialize any of these settings, nor does it add anything to kind of read those settings. So all of the work that you do now with the other screens, that's additional work that you have to do on top of using the template. Okay, so we're going to make sure that these things get initialized when the app starts, and then I'm going to make sure that I have this preference object stored in that instant variable so I can use it in a minute. So mPreferences is equal to preference manager dot get default shared preferences. Context is this. There we go. So that's the start. That's really all I need for my onCreate method. Okay. One thing we need to remember to do before we get too far into this, we've created this application subclass, but so far we haven't registered it in the manifest. So I'm going to go do that right now. Go over to the manifest. I'm going to say android.name Droid Cafe app. So now it knows about that application class. It'll run that onCreate method when the application starts. Before anything else occurs, before main activity runs or anything like that. Okay, so I've got the Droid Cafe app started. I want to add some methods in here so that I can read both of those settings in sort of a standard way. So I'm going to add those in here. I do want to add, yeah, I'm just going to add those in here. So public string get market. I'm going to say return preferences get string. The name of that string is market. And then let's say the default value is empty string. So if that setting's not set, we're going to get back empty string. And then also for the delivery method, I'm going to do that in a similar fashion. So get delivery method. Yeah, we remember in root preferences we called this delivery underscore method. So that's the string I'm going to use here. So I'm providing a standard way to get to both of these settings that I can use throughout my app, because it's pretty normal that once I have settings that I'm going to need to access them in a few different places in my app. It's usually not just one activity that needs to know about that setting. It's oftentimes more than one, and sometimes your job service needs to know about the setting as well as one of your activities. So by putting all this code into the application class, it means that I really only have to change it once if I need to add an additional setting, and I don't have to repeat a lot of this code in different places. Okay, so we've got the application class set up. The next thing I want to do is just prove that this is working. So what we're going to have it do is we're going to have it show a toast when we return to the main activity that shows the settings. Okay, so in main activity, I'm going to go up to the onCreate method, and I'm going to say let's get both of those two settings. Okay, so Droid Cafe app, you need to get the application first. I'm going to say get application. Remember that get application returns an application object, so we need to downcast that to our specific kind of application. Okay, so Droid Cafe app. I now have my app object, and now we can retrieve both of those settings. So string market is equal to app dot get market. String delivery method is equal to app dot get delivery method. And I should type that correctly. There we go. So we've read both of those settings. I now want to show those settings in a toast. So I think there's already a display toast method in here. Yep, there is. So I can call display toast with a message. Okay. So we're going to say display toast string dot format. I'm going to put both of these things together, and I want it to say the market colon %s. I'm going to put a line break between those two, and delivery colon %s. And I'm going to pass in the market and the delivery method to replace both of those %s's. Okay, so it should show up as market as one thing, and then underneath that you should see delivery as that. So if you're starting with the default settings, it should be saying market is US, and then it should be saying delivery is same day. Okay, so let's run this here. Okay, so when I start that, you can see the toast down at the bottom. The toast says US and same day. Now I may want to increase the length of that. Yeah, I'm going to make this length long so that it sticks around a little bit longer. Length long. That'll make it easier to see the message. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to give everybody a chance to get caught up there. Let me know when you're caught up with that. You have the toast appearing. Okay, cool. So right now, with the way we have this set up, we've got it put into the onCreate method. So it's reading both of those settings. Let's just do some quick testing with it. So if I go into my settings screen, all right, I'm going to go change one of those settings. So let's say we change the market to India, and we say we change the delivery method to next day. Okay, so both of those two things are changed. We don't have a toast, right, because we haven't run the onCreate yet for the main activity. Okay, so when I hit back, when I hit this up arrow here, I should see that toast appears with the new values, India and next day. Okay, now I hit back. Now notice how it shows up, IN and next day. It's using those values, right? Because we're reading it out of the settings file. It's using those values. It's not using those names. Okay, so that's what you should be seeing in the toast. Now, one bug that you may see is if I say, let's go back into settings. Okay, now rather than hitting, let's go change these again. So I'm going to hit Japan, and I'm going to hit pickup. Those are my settings. Let's hit the back arrow on the device. So if I hit back arrow, I'm going to see, oh, I didn't get a toast. Well, what happened? Okay, you're saying that your up arrow, up nav is not working for some reason. If you're missing your up nav, you want to make sure that you have the parent activity name set here for main activity, and you want to make sure this is pointing to main activity as well. So if you're not seeing the up nav, it's probably because you're missing something there. The other possibility is that if you're not seeing the up nav, it may be that you're missing this block there too. So going kind of back to the issue at hand, so we can see that the up arrow, right? So the up arrow is leading us back to main activity, and it's causing it to call on create when I do up, but it's not calling on create when I do back. Okay. All right. So if I take my code in main activity and I move it to on start's actually called both pathways. So let me add an onStart method here. If I move all my logic, those 4 lines of code that's toasting, into onStart, what I'll see is that then works. So if I go to the settings screen, I hit the up nav, I get the message. If I go to the settings screen and I hit the back navigation, that works as well. So if it's on in either on start or on resume, that's going to solve the issue. So usually for most just simple cases, for most cases, that's really all you have to do, is you just have to move the logic that's reading the setting over to on start rather than being in on create. That will solve it for most cases. Now, what we're going to look at when we cover 9.1 is that maybe this simple solution isn't the complete solution. Maybe it doesn't always work. Because for 9.1, I did find that just doing this still had some kind of oddities because of everything else, because of other things that are happening with that app. So, however, most cases, that's all you need to do to solve that problem. You just move it to either on start or on resume. So, the other thing you may want to do, because this can be kind of a bear to test two different ways. So just for testing purposes, I'm going to go ahead and put, no, I'm going to leave this as is. So one thing that you may want to do is have both the back and the up arrow actually do the same thing. So the way the back arrow works is fairly simple. It just calls the on back pressed method on that activity, which then calls finish on the activity. With the home button or the up arrow, in the code it's actually referred to as the home button. When you click that, it actually goes into the on. It's actually activating as a menu item, as an options menu item, and that actually then does a different set of code normally, and that's, at least per the official documentation, that's how it's supposed to be. I don't completely understand why that's supposed to be different than BackNav, but as it is, Android treats those two things as different. We can change that. So the way that you get the up nav and the back to work the same way is we go into that activity and we basically handle that menu item ourselves. So if I go into the settings activity and I start to implement on option item selected, okay, so we're going to implement that. I'm going to grab the ID of the item that's selected. So int ID is equal to item dot get item ID. And I'm going to say if that ID is Android dot R dot ID dot home. Okay, so this is a built-in ID. That's why I'm using Android dot R, not just R dot ID. I'm going to say if that is the home button, then we're going to do something else. Otherwise, we're going to fall back to the parent class behavior. So if it is the home button, I'm going to call on back pressed and return true. So what this does, by overriding on option item selected this way, what this does is makes that up arrow, the up navigation, work exactly like the back button. That way you don't have two different behaviors that you're having to test for and handle. And that can be an important thing, because sometimes it's okay that maybe you can figure out how to handle it both ways. But for instance, what we do with 9.1, it turns out that doesn't really get us to an ideal scenario. So we really need both pathways to do the same thing. So that's how we do that. So this is going to result in, when I hit the up arrow, it's not going to call on create. It's not going to recreate the main activity. It's just going to resume it. It's just going to go back and start and resume it. So we can test that real quick here. Settings, go back, toe still shows up, but it's not calling on create anymore. Okay. Questions? So we've hooked all that up. It's kind of an introductory sort of way of using that template to get things started and how to add our additional settings. One thing I might want to do before we leave this, the last thing I want to do before we leave this, is actually hook it up to do something, right? So we've created this delivery method setting, and what I want to now do is I'm going to make that delivery method setting your default delivery method setting. So right now, if I go to order, regardless of what setting you've picked, it's going to go to next day, right? So if I come back in here, it's always defaulting to next day. I'm going to go back and change this. See, I've set it to pickup. I'm going to change it to same day. Go back in order. So whatever I do with my order, and it's always defaulting right now to next day. And I would like it to pick up the setting that the user set, so they can choose what their default delivery method is. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to go into the order activity. We're going to start hooking up that logic. Okay, so a few things. I need, first of all, to have access to that setting. So I'm going to grab the application object. So Droid Cafe app is equal to Droid Cafe app get application. And I'm going to say we want to know which radio button is selected. Okay. So I'm going to switch on the application setting. So switch app dot get delivery method. Okay, so I'm going to say if it's set to same day, then I want to default it. I want to pick same day by default. If it is next day, I'm going to default that other radio item. And then if it's pickup, there. I'm going to still want to add a default case for anything else that might happen. So if for some reason it's some other value or it's not saved to the file, I'm going to have a default option there. Okay. Well, my same day setting, let's see what I want to do there. Well, I want to pre-select the same day radio button. Okay. Well, unfortunately, at least the way the code's written right now, I don't have any sort of reference to the radio buttons. They're not actually referenced in code here. So I need to call findViewById to get those controls. So in here, let's start doing that. So I'm going to say radio button, call it radio button, is equal to findViewById. I'm going to say r.id dot same day, and I'm going to mark that radio button as checked. So set checked, true. So if the setting is set to there, I need a break to make sure I don't go on to the next case because I don't want it to then go down to next day. So that'll check the radio button, the same day radio button, if that's what the setting is. Okay. Well, let's try to do the same thing for the next day. So radio button and findViewById r.id next day. Okay. We're going to set that radio button to checked. And break. Okay, so that should seem like it works. But notice that there I've got a red underline here. Now, it's important that I've named these two variables the same thing. I've got a radio button here and I've got a radio button there. The thing to understand with switch statements is that both of these variables are actually kind of in the same context. And part of that's because of the whole trickle down, of the whole fall through thing, right? If I didn't have a break statement here, it would continue down here. Well, then that would be a problem because, well, I've got two variables named the same thing. I can't have that, okay? So one way around that is just to extract this variable so it's defined at a kind of a broader context. So I could take that variable and define it up here, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to define it before the switch and then just use that same variable in both of these cases. That's going to get rid of the complaint that it has about, hey, you're defining the radio button variable twice. Okay, and then I can do the same thing for pickup. All right, and then my default case is going to be very simple. I'm just going to tell it to do nothing. In the case where there's no setting, we're just going to say, oh, just leave it as is in the as I designed it in the UI designer layout. So that way there's going to be some effect from the setting that I pick in the settings screen to the order screen. It's actually going to do something rather than just being, hey, I showed a toast. Okay. So if I go into settings now, let's set the delivery method to pickup. Go back and start order, and we'll see now, yay, pickup selected by default. I can try that with another setting. So let's say I pick same day. And let's go back to the order screen and we can see that it's pre-selected that. So that's kind of a common way to pick that up. You'll notice that I'm doing the reading here. I'm only doing it on create. As it turns out, it works here because of the pathway between the settings screen and the order screen, right? So in the order activity, there's no direct pathway to the settings screen. I can't go from the order screen to the settings screen. If I could, then I'd have some additional problems to solve, because just by putting it on create here, the order screen wouldn't know that it's changed. But because you have to go back to the main screen and go to settings, the only way to get to kind of from the settings screen to here requires going through the onCreate method of the order. Okay, so given that there's no settings item here, this works. But if I were to add a settings menu item, then I would need to potentially do a little bit more work. And that's part of why I had the problem on the main activity, but I don't have the problem here, is because when I go from settings, I'm going settings back to main, but here I'm going back to main and then down to order. Any questions there? Dalton, did you get your up navigation figured out? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna let's take a break here before we go back and look at the 9.1 lab. Let's call about a 15-minute, 20-minute break. So it's about 1:50-ish now. So let's resume with the 9.1 lab at 2:10.